The wrench slipped at the worst possible moment. Dorian Hale had been working on a faulty power conduit inside the maintenance shaft of Station Meriden for 6 straight hours. The shaft was narrow, hot, and smelled like burned wire. When the conduit finally gave out, it crackled and sent a pulse through the metal grating under his boots. Dorian lost his balance, grabbed for the nearest rail, missed it, and dropped 8 feet onto the lower platform. He landed hard on his side. Something sparked near his head. He lay still for a second, staring at the ceiling. Then he sat up, checked his fingers, and decided he was mostly fine. The station medic on duty sent him to Bay 3 for a scan. It was standard procedure after any fall. Dorian didn't argue. He wiped the grease off his hands, walked the long corridor to the medical wing, and sat down on the examination table without being asked. The room smelled clean in a way that felt almost aggressive. Everything in Bay 3 was white and silver. The instruments on the walls were thin and delicate, designed for alien hands that had 6 fingers and moved like water. Dr. Ivas entered without looking up from his datapad. He was tall even by Selvari standards, pale blue, with a narrow head and large dark eyes that reflected light like wet glass. His record was perfect. 312 years of practice, 0 errors, 17 published papers, and the kind of confidence that came from never once being wrong. He glanced at Dorian the way someone glances at a routine task briefly, without real interest. "Human male, standard assessment," he said to the room. His voice was translated by the station's ambient system into flat, accented words. "Lie back." Dorian lay back. The scan took 2 minutes. Ivas moved the instrument along Dorian's arm in slow, careful passes. He was looking for bone fractures. His attention drifted, as it sometimes did during simple cases, to a supply order he had been meaning to approve. He reached across to adjust the instrument's calibration. The tool slipped. It was a small movement, barely 3 centimeters. But the cutting edge of the calibration blade was exposed, and when it caught Dorian's forearm, it opened a clean line 4 centimeters long and deep enough to bleed immediately. Ivas went completely still. For a Selvari, a wound like that to the lower arm meant the subdermal nerve cluster was compromised. Fluid loss would begin triggering a cellular cascade within seconds. Without immediate intervention, specific intervention, the kind that required 3 trained hands and 2 separate compounds, the nerve damage would be permanent. He had seen Selvari lose the full use of a limb from a cut smaller than this. He reached for the emergency panel. Dorian looked down at his arm. A line of red was running toward his elbow. He pressed his other hand over it, applying pressure without thinking, the way a person does when they have been bleeding before and know what to do about it. "Oh," he said. Ivas's hand hovered over the emergency panel. He turned slowly back to the patient. Dorian was sitting up. He was looking at the cut with the expression of someone who had just spilled something on their shirt, mildly inconvenient, already calculating how to deal with it. He pressed harder with his palm. The bleeding slowed slightly. "You got a cloth?" Dorian asked. "Or one of those absorbent pad things?" Ivas did not move. "Doc," Dorian looked up at him. "Cloth, pad, anything." Ivas hit the emergency panel anyway. The lights in Bay 3 shifted from white to amber. Nurse Rella came through the door in 4 seconds, already reaching for the crash kit. She stopped when she saw Dorian sitting calmly on the table, one hand pressed over a bleeding forearm, watching her with a patient expression. "The instrument slipped," Ivas said. His voice was very quiet. "I cut the patient." Rella looked at the arm. She looked at Dorian. She looked at Ivas. "Is he in Cascade?" she asked. "I don't know," Ivas said. That was a sentence he had not said in 300 years. Dorian pressed his lips together. "I'm right here," he said. "I can tell you, it hurts, like a solid 4 out of 10, but I'm not dying. I've had worse from a cargo net." He paused. "Can I please have a cloth?" Rella crossed the room and pressed a med pad against his arm with professional speed. Dorian held it there. He watched the amber lights. "Is this an emergency?" he asked. "Yes," said Ivas. "For who?" Ivas opened his mouth and then closed it. Rella was looking at the blood that had soaked into the first pad. She swapped it for a second one. Then she stood very still, watching the wound beneath it. The bleeding was already reduced. She had seen subdermal cuts on Selvari patients bleed continuously for 20 minutes before intervention. This human had been slowing on his own in under 90 seconds. She started logging everything. She did not know why yet. She just knew this was something she needed to write down. Out in the corridor, the amber light above Bay 3's door was blinking. It was visible from the central hub of the medical wing. 3 aliens stopped walking to look at it. A passing maintenance supervisor notified his supervisor. That supervisor sent a message to Station Commander Lith. Lith was in the middle of a trade summit. She read the message, set down her water glass, and closed her eyes for one long second. In Bay 3, Dorian Hale asked if there was anything to eat. He hadn't had lunch. Word moved through Station Meriden, the way bad news always does, faster than anyone intended and louder than the facts deserved. By the time the amber light above Bay 3 had been on for 11 minutes, Commander Lith was walking quickly down the main corridor with 2 of her staff behind her. By 14 minutes, a junior consortium officer had already sent a preliminary report to the Central Medical Board. By 18 minutes, a legal flag had been raised on Dr. Ivas's practitioner file. All of this happened while Dorian sat on the examination table, eating a protein block that Rella had found in a supply drawer. He ate it slowly, without complaint, still holding the med pad against his arm. Rella was documenting everything she saw. She changed the pad a 3rd time and noted that the bleeding had reduced further. She asked Dorian a question. "Does the pain feel the same as when it first happened?" "Bit less," he said, mouth still half full. "Maybe a 3 now." She wrote that down. Then she asked, "Does the area feel numb?" "No, still feels like a cut." She wrote that down too. In a Selvari patient by this point, numbness would have begun spreading outward from the wound. Nerve suppression was the body's way of protecting a damaged cluster. It was also, usually, the beginning of the end for that cluster. There was no numbness here. There was also no spreading discoloration. The tissue around the wound was holding. Ivas stood near the wall and said nothing. He had not moved from that spot. Commander Lith came through the door. She looked at Dorian. She looked at Ivas. She looked at Rella's notes on the secondary screen. "What is his condition?" she asked. "Stable," Rella said. "Since when?" "Since the injury." Lith turned to look at Dorian again. He raised the hand holding the protein block in a small wave. "I'm all right," he said. "I keep saying that." Lith was Thuven. Her species expressed alarm through a subtle tightening of the gill ridges along their neck. Hers were very tight. She turned to Ivas and lowered her voice. "The legal notification has already gone out." "I know," Ivas said. "The consortium will want a report within the hour." "I know that too." Dr. Sura arrived 4 minutes later. She was the only human physician assigned to Station Meriden, and she had the kind of walk that people had when they were used to being sent for only after others had decided the situation was beyond them. She was not tall. She wore no insignia. She carried a small bag over one shoulder and looked, if anything, slightly tired. She glanced at the room. She took an Ivas at the wall, Lith near the door, Rella at the screen, and Dorian on the table. She went to Dorian first. She lifted the med pad, looked at the cut for 3 full seconds, then pressed the pad back down firmly. "How's the pain?" "3-ish," Dorian said. "Fingers?" He wiggled them. All 5 moved cleanly. She opened her bag and took out a small kit. Inside it was a needle, medical thread, and a sealed tube of antiseptic. She put on a pair of thin gloves. Behind her, Rella made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Sura began cleaning the wound. Dorian turned his face away, not from pain, but from mild personal distaste at watching the process. Sura worked quickly and without drama, the way someone works when they have done a thing many times. Then she began to stitch. There were 4 observers in Bay 3 at that moment. All 4 of them were watching. The 2 who worked in medicine had seen thousands of wound closure procedures. Neither of them had seen this one: thread, an actual needle, pulling tissue together like fabric on a seam. Rella said very quietly, "That is mechanical closure." "Yes," Sura said, not looking up. "You're using physical tension to hold the wound edges together. That's how stitches work." Rella looked at Ivas. Ivas was staring at Sura's hands with an expression that, on a Selvari face, was almost impossible to read. But Rella had worked with him for 40 years, and she thought it looked like the first stage of something he would not name yet. Dorian breathed out slowly as the last stitch went in. "Better," he said. Sura tied off the thread, applied a seal dressing over the top, and stood up. She looked at Commander Lith. "He'll need the dressing changed in 24 hours. No heavy lifting for 3 days. He'll be completely functional within 2 weeks." Lith's gill-ridges did not loosen. 2 weeks, she repeated. "For full tissue repair. The wound itself will hold in 48 hours. There was a short silence. Counselor Brev's arrival notification came through on Lith's communicator. He was docking now. He had been dispatched by the consortium the moment the legal flag appeared on Ivas's file. He was not coming to check on Dorian. He was coming because a 300-year surgical record had just ended, and someone needed to manage what came next. Dorian read the shift in the room. He looked at Sura. "Is this going to become a whole thing?" She sat down on the stool beside the table. "Yes," she said plainly, "it is." He looked at his bandaged arm, then he shrugged with the other shoulder. "Okay, as long as I don't have to stand the whole time. My back still hurts from the fall." Counselor Brev had conducted 41 formal medical inquiries in his career. He was good at them. He knew how to enter a room, where to sit, and how to look at a defendant in a way that communicated both fairness and expectation. He had a system, and he trusted it. The system began to struggle within the first 10 minutes. The inquiry was held in a mid-sized conference room on level 4 of Station Meriden. Brev sat at the head of the table. Ivas sat to his left with a legal advocate who kept her hands folded and said very little. Dorian sat across from Ivas with a cup of water he had asked for and a bandaged arm resting on the table. Dr. Sura sat beside Dorian. Rella was called as a witness and sat near the far wall with her documentation. Brev opened by stating the purpose of the inquiry, to determine whether Dr. Ivas had committed an act of negligent harm against a protected patient under consortium medical law. He asked Ivas to confirm that the instrument had slipped. Ivas confirmed it. He asked Ivas to confirm that no consent had been given for a cutting procedure. Ivas confirmed that too. He asked Ivas to describe the wound. Ivas described it: 4 centimeters, subdermal depth, lower right forearm, proximate to the nerve cluster. Brev turned to Dorian. "And what is your current level of impairment?" Dorian looked at his arm, then at Brev. "None." Brev paused. "None as in minor impairment you are choosing not to report?" "None as in none," Dorian said. "I can move everything, it's sore, that's it." Brev looked at his notes. He looked at Rella. "Can you walk us through what you observed?" Rella read from her documentation in careful order. Bleeding slowed within 90 seconds. No spreading discoloration. No nerve suppression response. No cascade indicators at any point during the post-injury window. Wound edges responded to physical closure. Patient reported decreasing pain levels over time rather than increasing ones. The room was quiet while she read. Brev asked, "At what point did the neural degradation begin?" Rella looked up from her notes. "It didn't. There must have been some indicator of Counselor, Rella set the datapad down. There was no degradation at any point. I documented every 3 minutes for the first hour. The wound behaved as though the nerve cluster was unaffected. Brev turned back to Dorian. He seemed to be reorganizing something in his thinking. Do you feel pain currently? A little, around a 2. And you are functional, mentally present. Dorian tilted his head. I passed a math problem on the way here if that helps. Sura stepped in and her voice was level and calm. Counselor, I think the inquiry may be working from an incorrect premise. The expected outcome, nerve degradation, cascade, impairment, those are Selvari outcomes. Human physiology handles subdermal wounds differently. Brev looked at her. Differently how? Sura leaned forward slightly. She explained the clotting process first. She explained how human blood carried proteins that responded to a breach in the vessel wall, creating a temporary plug, then a harder seal over time. She explained that humans had pain receptors that signaled damage without shutting down function. She explained that the tissue around a wound did not degrade, it inflamed, to increase blood flow to the area, and then it began to repair. And then she said something that made Brev go very still. In humans, she said, the tissue that forms over a healed wound is often structurally stronger than the original. The advocate beside Ivos put down her pen. Brev said, stronger. Denser, we call it scar tissue. It's a known property. It's in our basic biology. Brev looked at Ivos. Did you know this? Ivos's answer was honest, and it cost him something to give it. No, my knowledge of human physiology came from a 2-page summary in the consortium's new species intake file. The file noted that humans were biological standard with minor variants. He paused. The file was wrong. Nobody disputed that. Dorian had been quiet for a while. He looked at Ivos. You thought you'd killed me, didn't you? Or at least permanently hurt me? Ivos met his eyes. Yes. And that's why you hit the emergency panel. Yes. Dorian nodded slowly, not unkindly. All right, that actually explains the whole day. Brev set his stylus down. He looked at his notes, then at the room, then at nothing in particular. After a moment he said, I am formally suspending the negligence determination. He held up a hand before the legal advocate could respond. Not dismissing it, suspending it, because I cannot evaluate harm without first understanding what harm means to this species, and it is clear to me that the consortium does not currently know. He looked at Sura. I want everything you just told me in writing, documented, sourced. She nodded. I can do that. And you, he looked at Dorian, are you willing to participate in further observation, voluntarily? Dorian picked up his cup of water. Will they feed me? Sura said, yes. Then sure. Dr. Ivos came to find Sura on his own. He did not send a message first. He walked to the small office she had been given on level 2, knocked twice on the open door, and stood there with his hands at his sides. He was not in his surgical coat. Without it, he looked less like a doctor and more like someone who had been thinking too hard for too long and was tired of it. Sura looked up from her screen. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. He sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I want to understand, he said finally. Not for the inquiry, not for the report. I want to understand for myself. Sura studied him for a moment. Then she turned her screen to face him and slid a datapad across the desk. Start with that. It was a summary of human medical history. Not current medicine, old medicine. The kind practiced before any alien contact, before cellular regeneration technology, before the consortium existed. Surgery performed without the tools that Ivos considered basic. Bones set by hand and held in place with splints made from wood. Wounds packed with cloth and tied shut. Infections fought with nothing but the patient's own body, and eventually, crude compounds that humans had discovered by accident. Ivos read slowly. Sura watched his face while he read. She had done this before, shown a non-human colleague a history they were not prepared for, and the reaction was almost always the same. First, a kind of clinical skepticism, because the procedures described sounded more like damage than medicine. Then something shifted. The skepticism became something quieter. He set the datapad down. "They survived this," he said. "It was not a question." "Many of them, yes. Without cascade protection, without neural shielding, without cellular regeneration. Without any of that." He was quiet again. "Then how?" "Their bodies were built for it," Sura leaned back. "Selvari evolved in a stable environment. Low predation pressure, consistent climate. Few pathogens. Your biology optimized for precision and longevity. You don't need to recover from damage because damage was rare." Ivas said nothing. "Humans evolved on a world that did not care whether they survived. Predators, disease, weather, each other, all of it constantly. So the biology that made it through wasn't the kind that avoided damage. It was the kind that kept going after damage happened." "The clotting," Ivas said slowly. "The clotting, the inflammation response. The adrenaline system which lets a human continue functioning at full capacity even with significant injury for a short period. The pain tolerance range. The scarring. All of it is adaptive." Ivas picked up the datapad again and found a specific entry. A historical account of a soldier in an early human conflict who had continued directing others for 2 hours after a wound that, by the physiological data attached, should have rendered him unconscious. He stared at it. "He didn't go unconscious," he said. "No." "Why not?" "Because he needed to stay awake, so his body found a way." Rella appeared in the doorway. She had her own datapad and the look of someone who had not stopped working since the inquiry ended. "I finished the comparative analysis," she said. She stepped inside and laid the pad on the desk so both of them could see it. "Human scar tissue, cross-referenced against original tissue samples from the same patient records." She pointed to a column of numbers. "The scar tissue shows higher tensile strength across every sample, some by 30%, one outlier case by almost 60. Ivas looked at the numbers. He looked at Sura. Sura nodded. "They don't just heal," Rella said. Her voice had gone a little strange. Not upset, something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something large. "They rebuild the damaged area stronger than it was before. The injury is incorporated, made part of the structure." Outside the office, the corridor had been getting noisier through the afternoon. Word had traveled from the inquiry room to the general population of the station, the way interesting things travel person to person, each one adding a layer of emphasis. A human had been cut open and hadn't noticed. A human had been stitched shut with thread and walked out talking. A human's wound was reportedly healing faster than it should be possible to heal. The corridor outside the medical wing had a small crowd in it now. Not loud, just present. Various species standing at a respectful distance, watching the door of Sura's office as though something important was happening inside it. Dorian appeared at the end of the corridor, coming back from the food hall, and found 40 aliens looking in his general direction. He stopped, he looked behind himself, he looked back at them. "Is something happening?" he said. Someone near the front answered him. It was a young Thuvan engineer with a translation bead clipped to his collar. "They say your blood builds walls," he said, in careful, translated words. Dorian looked at his bandaged arm. He looked at the crowd. "I mean," he said, "not exactly like that, but," he paused. "It's complicated. It's mostly just how we're put together." The Thuvan engineer translated this for those around him who hadn't understood. There was a murmur. Several people in the crowd looked at their own arms. The message from the Galactic Medical Consortium arrived addressed to Admiral Gareth. It was formal, carefully worded, and asked for a joint research initiative. The subject line called it a study into human biological resilience and potential galactic applications. The tone was polite. Gareth read it twice, then sent a copy to Sura with a note at the bottom that said, "Your call." Sura read the message, put it aside, and went back to her comparative data. 2 hours later, she went to find Ivas. He was in the observatory corridor on level 6, standing at the long window that looked out over the docking ring. Several human crew members from Gareth's ship were working outside on a damaged hull panel, suited up, moving steadily through the procedure without haste. Ivas was watching them. Sura stood beside him. She handed him the consortium message. He read it without changing his expression. Then he said, "They want to study humans." "Yes. Like a new data set." "That's how it reads." She took the message back. "I'm going to say yes to the collaboration, but I have conditions." He turned his head slightly. "Dorian is credited as a person in any published record, not as a specimen, not as the patient or a reference number, by name." She paused. "And I want a co-author on the foundational paper." He was quiet for a moment. "You mean me?" "I mean you. You made the cut. The inquiry started because of your instrument. That chain of events led to everything we now know." She looked out at the workers on the hull. "You should see where it ends." Ivas turned back to the window. He watched the human crew for a long moment. One of them was doing something with a plasma cutter, controlled, steady strokes, vacuum all around them, nothing between them and open space but a suit they trusted completely. "When I reviewed the intake file on humans," he said slowly, "the phrase was minor biological variance from standard. That was the entire note on physiology." "I know. I wrote a formal complaint about that file 2 years ago." "Did they respond?" "They said they would update it in the next revision cycle." She paused. "They hadn't." Ivas made a sound that might have been the Selvari equivalent of a short, humorless laugh. 300 years, he said. "I trusted that file." "Everyone trusted it, that's the problem." He turned away from the window. "I'll co-author, one condition of my own." She waited. "The paper says what we found plainly. No softening the implication that we, every medical practitioner in the consortium, have been treating humans according to assumptions we never verified." He met her eyes. "If we write it honestly." She nodded, agreed. The pushback started the next morning. 3 senior Selvari institutions sent formal objections to the consortium's proposed initiative. The language was academic, but the meaning was plain. They felt the initiative implied their species' biology was a weakness. One institution's letter described the study as potentially harmful to interspecies relations. Another suggested the findings were preliminary and should not be circulated without a longer review period. Counselor Brev forwarded all 3 letters to Admiral Gareth, presumably for diplomatic awareness. Gareth read them, wrote 2 words in reply, and then requested a formal address to the Consortium Council. He got it the following day. He stood at the speaker's position in the council chamber, a room designed to make whoever stood there feel small, which it did not, and he spoke for 4 minutes. He said that humanity had joined the consortium in good faith, and in good faith had trusted the consortium's medical practices. He said that those practices had been applied to humans based on documents that were, to put it plainly, incomplete. He said that the research initiative was not a study of human frailty or alien inferiority. It was a correction, and corrections, in his experience, were only threatening to people who had never learned to make them. He sat down. The chamber was silent. The 3 objecting institutions did not withdraw their letters, but they also sent no further ones. Rella, who had been present for the council address via remote feed, turned off the screen and went back to her analysis. She had 42 more tissue samples to get through before morning. In the evening, she knocked on Sura's door and found her already at work on the first draft of the paper. Rella sat down across from her, pulled out her own notes, and the 2 of them worked in comfortable silence for 3 hours. Dorian stopped by at some point, ate half a thing from Sura's food tray without asking, looked over their shoulders at the data, said, "That's my arm," and left. The paper was published on a Wednesday. By Friday, it had been downloaded 400,000 times across the consortium's academic network. By the following week, the number was past 2 million. Not all of them were medical professionals. Some were biologists, some were historians, some were ordinary people who had heard a version of the story and wanted to read the original. A few were philosophy students who had been assigned it by professors who had read it the day it came out. The title was plain: Resilience as Evolutionary Architecture, a case study in human biological response. The lead authors were listed as Dr. Ivas and Dr. Sura. The patient was listed by full name, Dorian Hale, with a note that his participation had been voluntary and that he had reviewed and approved all sections pertaining to his case. The medical findings were reported exactly as they had been observed. There was a section near the end, Ivas had written it himself, that addressed the errors in the consortium's intake documentation for humans and recommended a full review of intake files for all species admitted to the consortium in the past 50 years. It named the process that had failed. It named the institutions responsible for maintaining the files. It did not soften any of it. That section generated the most response. A young Selvari student named Ronve published an essay in reply. It was not a medical paper. It was a short piece of writing, less than 1,000 words, titled, "What Does It Mean to Heal?" She argued that the consortium had spent centuries defining health as the absence of damage, when perhaps health was more accurately defined as the capacity to continue in spite of it. The essay was not formally peer-reviewed. It was passed around by word of mouth, then by message network, then by official academic relay until it was being cited in papers she had never heard of. She was 23. She had not expected any of that. The consortium's annual medical symposium was held 6 months after the paper's publication. The keynote slot was offered to Ivas as a recognition of the paper's impact. He declined the keynote and asked instead to present jointly with Dr. Sura and to have Dorian Hale present in the audience. The symposium's organizing committee agreed. Ivas was not sure they understood why he had asked. He was not sure he could fully explain it himself. It had to do with correctness. He had made the cut. He wanted to stand in the room where the outcome of that cut was being described, and he wanted the man whose arm it had been to be there as well. Dorian came. He brought his daughter, who was 12, curious, and deeply unimpressed by the formality of the venue. She spent most of the opening address looking at the food display near the entrance. Ivas opened the presentation with a single line. He said, 300 years of surgery taught me that precision meant preventing damage. A human taught me that surviving damage was its own precision. Then he stepped back and let Sura take over for the technical portion, which she did with the same clean directness she brought to everything. The room was full, standing at the back. Dorian watched from the 5th row. He was aware that people were looking at him, and he was aware that he found it mildly uncomfortable, and he sat through it anyway because Sura had asked him to be there, and he thought she deserved that. After the presentation, there was a reception. Dorian was talking to his daughter near the food table when Ivas found him. The surgeon stood at what Dorian recognized as a careful, formal distance. He looked, for the first time since Dorian had met him, uncertain. Not professionally uncertain. Just human, which was the wrong word for it, but the closest one Dorian had. "I wanted to apologize," Ivas said, "formally, not to the inquiry, to you." Dorian turned to face him. He thought about it for a moment, not long. "You made a mistake," he said. "Then you did right by it. Where I come from, that's about as good as it gets." He held out his hand. Ivas looked at it. He had learned the gesture. He took the hand and shook it carefully, the way someone does when they are treating a thing with the respect it has earned. Dorian's daughter looked up from her food. "Is that the doctor who cut you?" Yeah, Dorian said. She looked at Ivas. Does your planet have those fried dough things? Ivas blinked. We do not. Too bad. She went back to eating. Later, Ivas stood alone at the window at the end of the reception hall. Outside, a human maintenance crew was running a routine check on the station's external sensors, suited up, working methodically through a long checklist in the dark of open space. He watched them for a while. He had spent 3 centuries believing that the highest form of medicine was the prevention of harm. He still believed that, but he was beginning to understand that it was not the only form. There was something else, something he did not yet have the right words for, in the way a living thing could absorb a wound, rebuild around it, and continue. He did not have the words yet. He was fairly sure that studying it would take longer than the rest of his career. He thought that was all right.